Carol, yes, it's my great privilege to introduce my colleague, Dr. Tara Martin. A little bit about Tara. She did her PhD at the University of Queensland in Australia. And then she came here to UBC in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences to do a postdoctoral fellowship. And that's where I first got to know her. She then went back to Australia, unfortunately, and was a senior research scientist with CSIRO, which is their sort of national research organization. And then we got her back to UBC, again in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences in 2016, and she's a professor and Lieber Eero Chair in Conservation with us now. What you might not know about Tara is that she was actually born on Salt Spring Island. And she now lives there whenever she doesn't have to be at UBC with her kids, Silke and Mateo. So Tara's field is conservation decision-making, so how we make decisions about which species we can save and maybe which species we can't. And she'll say a lot more about that. And a lot of her work since she's come back to UBC has been in the area of the Salish Sea. And she's going to be talking about that tonight. I'm going to mention that we will have discussion questions at the end, but I'm also going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any thoughts as Tara's talking, please type them into the chat, or if you'd like to put your questions in there, you could do that, and then I'll be able to ask them afterward. So, Tara, I'm not seeing your screen anymore. Is it being shared? It seemed to disappear.
Yeah, it looks like when it started recording, it froze. So I'm just going to reshare.
We're getting there.
Okay, what are you seeing? Are you seeing?
We still got the notes.
Okay, and then we'll just do this. And we should be away.
Perfect. Thanks, Tara.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Cindy, for that wonderful introduction. I really enjoy getting to speak with conservation organizations up and down the coast because it's through these grassroots organizations that a lot of really good and really important work gets done. And that's the motivation for what I do. So as Cindy said, I'm a conservation decision scientist, which really means I build models to predict the outcomes of different pressures on our ecosystems, and then I use those predictions to help inform decisions about what activities we should take, where we should take them, and when in time to recover our biodiversity and the species and ecosystems that we care so deeply about. So I'm going to talk this evening about this idea of shifting baselines and this idea of ecocultural restoration and what that entails. And the focus of my talk is really in the Salish Sea, in this area of darker green. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, okay. So a lot of our work, this entire region is kind of classified as the Salish Sea. A lot of the work that I'm going to present this evening is really based on data collected from the San Juans up into some of the northern Gulf Islands, but really largely, I'd say, kind of from Nanaimo down to the San Juans, this kind of patch in here. So as Cindy said, I grew up in the Gulf Islands. I was born on Salt Spring Island, and I spent much of my youth wandering through the forests and playing on the beach. And it certainly imprinted on me the smells and the tastes of the soil, the sound of the ocean, the saltiness of the air, all of that had a profound impact on me and ultimately what I decided to do as an adult in my life. And during my lifetime, I just turned 50, so I have a half a century of observations in this region. During my lifetime, I've watched, meadows, these ecocultural meadows, such as this Camas meadow, and these, deep, rich meadows of sea blush. I've watched them kind of turn from these into this. And this is probably a picture of what most people would recognize islands looking like in the Gulf Islands, that they are still incredibly beautiful, but they're vastly different to what they used to look like. And so at the same time, I've watched forests go from this to this, to some cases to even this and this. These are profoundly different ecosystems. There's been huge ecological impacts, but people still find these ecosystems beautiful, and people relate to these ecosystems today as if this is normal. Watch shrubs go from this type of structure to this more simplified structure to things like this, which are highly modified. And so what is going on in these ecosystems that is radically changing these spaces? And this is where I want to introduce this concept of shifting baselines. Many of you would be familiar with this idea. It was coined by Daniel Pauly back in the mid-90s, and Daniel's a world-renowned fisheries ecologist, biologist here at UBC. And he defines shifting baselines as something like, we alter the world but forget what it was like beforehand, and each subsequent generation regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal. Well, that's what I see happening in the Salish Sea. I see my children, for example, looking at the world around them, and that has become their normal. Yet my normal has shifted markedly. And so Daniel really got this idea from working in the fisheries and seeing these vast changes in aquatic ecosystems. And so this is an image taken from a Florida jetty of a catch from a charter in 1957. And this postdoctoral researcher, Laura McLeachin-Kent, she did a really wonderful series of research looking at this shifting baselines in this region. And so you see these people, they're happy, they've caught these fish that are just almost obscenely enormous. They are so large, we don't see huge, big cod and ropers like that anymore. By 1958, we still have some of these huge fish, but not as many, but the people are still happy and smiling. By 1968, fewer fish, slightly different mix of species composition. By 1978, very different species composition, but still happy, happy folks. They had a good haul, and but an entirely different group of animals than what was caught 2 decades earlier. And then another decade on, again, a ton of fish, but different species again, and much, much smaller. Till the last, when she finished her dissertation in 2007, she went out on a fishing charter, and this is what they caught on her charter. So this idea that we modify our homes and our environment, but we forget what it was like beforehand, is really devastating ecologically. Even though it might not change people's relative happiness about living in a place, ecologically, we're accepting normal as less and less. And so what are these drivers of change in this region? There's so many different things going on, but one of the key drivers of change has been the loss of First Nation stewardship. And that's one of the drivers that we don't talk about as much, but we've lost a whole way of living and stewarding these places within the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem, in which a lot of our work is undertaken, cultural burning was a really key component of stewardship of these ecosystems. There is extensive plant propagation, movement of propagules from place to place, weeding out propagules and plants that were not of high value, and promoting plants that were of higher value for medicines, for food. Meticulous tending of food gardens, these gardens that were passed through the matrilineal line, similar to clam gardens. Hunting of herbivores and other species. We've also had, since colonization, we've had enormous changes in predator populations. So in the Southern Gulf Islands and San Juans, we've had almost a complete extirpation of wolves and cougars. And in response, we've had this explosion in black-tailed deer abundance. So deer abundances are up to 10 times what they were historically on many of these islands. We've had extensive land use change. So we've had extensive agricultural and rural development. We've had industrial forestry, and we've altered the hydrology in many places. And then we've also introduced a whole bunch of things. When I jumped on the call this evening, there was a conversation about invasive species. So we've introduced many plants purposely and many things incidentally. And now we're paying the price as these plants move beyond the garden gate and into these ecosystems. We've also have non-native animal introductions like Canada geese. Most of the Canada geese within this region stem from introductions from goose populations on the eastern coast. And then we have domestic animals which have either gone feral and remain sheep, goats, and rabbits. And then on top of that, we have climate change. So climate change is altering these ecosystems in various ways and leading to many interesting interactions between these other pressures, and also leading to novel interactions. So we have high levels of drought stress in our cedar forests, for example. We have disease and pathogens. We have changes in fire risk as a result of interactions between browsing and loss of understory and drying of soil horizons and climate change. So these things are interacting in complex ways, and a lot of the research that my team undertakes is trying to unpack these interactions. And so in every place along our coast and in these islands where there's a settler village, there was likely a First Nation village. All of the Gulf Islands and large islands had multiple village sites on them, Northern Gulf Islands and the Southern Gulf Islands. And so, as I said, that burning, that propagation of plants, that was a hugely important. Predators, again, hugely important in controlling these herbivores like black-tailed deer, and also elk and moose. We also have the industrial forestry. Only 1% of these Douglas fir bioclimatic zone is still in a state of old growth anymore. And then, of course, tree dieback. That's another big driver. So we've been out and working in this space for quite a long time. As Cindy said, during my postdoc over 15 years ago, I came out and I started thinking about one of these drivers of change, which was really this trophic cascade, this loss of predators, loss of First Nation hunting of ungulates, and how it had led to this hyperabundance of deer. And so my team has been out unpacking some of this research. We have sites stratified, across the Salish Sea. These are just a few of the areas. We have over 150 bird count locations, over 100 vegetation survey sites, pollinator survey areas, and we're adding new things every year as we get new grad students joining the team. So this is just part of the team that was out surveying sites this past field season, where we had a crew out from March until August. And we're out installing these soil moisture meters. And so these soil moisture meters, which you can see on the right-hand side, and then we've got a camera trap being installed on the left here. And what we're trying to do here is get a better estimates of density of black-tailed deer. And then with the soil moisture meters, we're trying to start to unpack what's happening in the soil horizon as a result of the interaction between browsing by deer and climate drought stress. Now, this is just a couple of my team members, Kefra and Sophie. They are actually counting flowering stems. And the reason they're counting these flowering stems is that we are really interested in what pollinators are doing in these systems. And so we've been publishing work on looking at impacts of browsing and other stressors on the vegetation and on bird populations and on culturally important plants. And most recently, we've been turned our attention to thinking about bumblebees. What are the impacts of hyperabundant black-tailed deer, for example, on bumblebee populations? And so just looking at one particular stressor, because it gets quite complex to look at it all, I'm going to focus really on the hyperabundance of deer populations. And kind of looking at that one stressor, we can see how the vegetation structure changes markedly as deer density increases from less than 0.01 deer per hectare up to over 1 deer per hectare. And that change in that understory is reflected in a huge change in the shrub understory. So these are just a few of the culturally important shrub species in the region. We have Nootka rose, trailing blackberry, red huckleberry, and Saskatoon. And we can start to look at, so what's actually happening with different plants that are culturally important, and also the overall flora. So looking at the native flora. And what this graph just shows is that once we, in sites where there's no deer, so these are islands where deer are completely absent, we have much higher numbers of native shrubs and higher numbers of these culturally important food plants. And so once we have over kind of 0.08 deer a hectare, we start to basically, we see this marked decline. And so we can also see here that we have about an 81% decline from sites that have no deer to sites with just some deer. So there's a lot that's happening. It's really hard to find control sites where we have even lower deer densities than this, but we know that in all of the places where deer are present in the islands right now, they're at high densities, higher than what these shrubs and culturally important species can stand. So if we look at the diversity, we also see that same drop in the diversity. So this is both the abundance and the types of plants in the shrub understory. And then we also see a drop in the richness. So this is the number of different species. So what does that mean for some of the other things that rely on those shrubs and on that understory for nesting and foraging? Woodland birds are a really good indicator for trying to assess those changes. And this was some of the work I did in my postdoc when I came back to UBC from Australia. And what we found was that, you know, the species that rely on the canopy, so up high in the canopy, were not very impacted by what was going on in the understory, and that's to be expected because they spend most of their foraging and nesting time high up in the canopy. But what we did find was that those species that nest and predominantly forage in the understory were quite negatively impacted by browsing by deer. And so this is an indirect impact through the loss of that understory structure and habitat. And so in this graph, we just along the bottom, we have several different very common species of woodland bird found in this region, from rufous hummingbird, orange-crowned warbler, song sparrow, fox sparrow, and winter wren. And then we have low, moderate, and high levels of browsing. And this is just showing that we have a much significantly higher relative abundance of rufous hummingbirds on islands with low levels of browsing. And I should say that the reason why we use these islands for a lot of our research is that they're perfect petri dishes, if you like. We can use an entire island as a treatment and view it as isolated, even though we know that birds are moving between islands and that even deer can swim between islands. There's still really good, a good way to at least control for levels of deer density. So we can estimate the deer density on a particular island and start to build up a story around what is happening on that particular island under that particular levels of stressors such as deer browsing. And so we find this pattern of declining relative abundance of these common woodland birds with increasing levels of browsing. And then this last couple of years, we started thinking about, well, what is the impact on other things, such as pollinators that are using these ecosystems? Worldwide, there's been a huge decline in invertebrates and in pollinators in particular, and in bees and bumblebees in particular. And so we focused on bumblebees because there are a group of distinct native bumblebees in the Salish Sea. And we wanted to look at, how was this change in understory mediated through browsing by black-tailed deer, how is that impacting pollinators, or is it even impacting these bumblebees? And this is Kefra Beckett, one of my master's students who led this study. And she's sitting in this exquisite meadow on one of our island sites with no deer. This is a meadow in this photo was taken, I think, in early April. And this meadow is in its prime of fawn lilies at the time this photo is taken. Throughout the season, this meadow goes from fawn lilies to chocolate lilies to bare stem desert parsley, and then camas and sea blush. It's quite extraordinary. And so this is an example of a plot. So here we're measuring these flowering stems. On the left, we have a typical site where there's deer. This is on the left is a Gulf Island National Park site. This is Cabbage Island. And on the right, we have an island which is stewarded by First Nations, by the Wasanich. And this is an island with no deer. So you can visually see there's a huge difference just in the floral resources that you find. And so it was no huge surprise that on these islands where deer are absent, we have over twice as many bumblebees on these islands. And so there's some really, I think important messages around what's happening to our birds, what's happening to our bumblebees, and what's happening to our forests overall, just as a result of this single pressure. So we're now, as I said, working to expand our knowledge of these pressures, because we know it's more complex than just what deer are doing. We also have early indications that the interaction between browsing and climate change is probably leading to some very dire consequences for our forests, with particularly with respect to increased drought stress and increased fire risk, which has implications not only for wildlife, but also for people living in these areas. So I wanted to switch now to thinking about, well, we know we're gaining this picture about how these ecosystems go from these, very diverse, rich, structurally complex ecosystems to these much more simplified ecosystems. But how do we go back? And that's really the focus of a lot of the work my team does. We want to understand what the impacts are, but really more importantly, we want to understand what management strategies should we be taking to try to restore these ecosystems in a good way. So I want to talk about a couple of projects that we've been working on with local nations in this region. We work really closely with the Hulkamini speaking nations, so the Penelakut, Cowichan, and Liaxin, Halalt nations. And we also work really closely with the Tsimshian speaking nations. So these are the Wasanich nations, the Sartlam, Sakum, Sayout nations. And one of the projects that I was been involved with over the last couple of years has been around, land back. And so some of our work has revealed that land that is being stewarded by nations is doing a lot better than land that is currently being stewarded by our parks, by the Gulf Islands National Parks, for example. And so a couple of years ago, we had this island, Halibut Island, came up for sale. It was an island that I had adored ever since I was little. It was owned privately, but we used to fish on either side of this island, and I would get out the binoculars and I could see the exquisite wildflowers on this island. The fellow that had owned it, he passed away about 6 years ago, and then the family put the island up for sale. And I had been involved in protecting a few other islands in the Salish Sea, and those islands had become part of the Gulf Island estate. And I've been saddened at, I think, the lack of good stewardship of those islands. And so I decided to try a different approach. And this approach was to try to find a donor to buy the island and to hand it back to the Wasanich people. And that's what happened. So I was able to find donors to put up the money, that then transferred the money to the Land Conservancy, which held the title until the Wasanich nations were able to take on board that title through the establishment of their own land trust. So this island sits off, this is Victoria International Airport, and then if we come out here, this is Sydney Island, which is half in the Gulf Islands National Park, and then this is Halibut right here. And so this is just the moment in which the agreement took place. It was a really exciting moment. We had our donors, which are they're ex-Microsoft, Linda and David Cornfield, ex-Microsoft techs, and who are very passionate about conservation in the Salish Sea. They put up the money, and then the Land Conservancy, as I said, they held the title until Wasanich was able to take over that title. So now we're working with the nations to do active restoration on the island, even despite it being in really good condition, better than most islands. There's still a lot of work to be done. So we're reinstating fire, for example. We're weeding and propagating. And so this is just some of what the island currently looks like. When you walk onto it, you're you're greeted by knee deep in wildflowers, and particularly these extensive camas gardens, just absolutely breathtaking. And some of these camas, the bulbs are, the size of medium-sized potatoes, and that means they're probably in the realm of 50 to 70 years old at least. So we're just starting to realize that you can age some of these plants that have these bulbs. They have growth rings just like a tree, and so you can cut them in half and look at them under the microscope and count those growth rings. Fawn lilies are exquisite. And this chocolate lily, we think, is probably close to almost 100 years old, just based on the size of the bulb. A similar plant beside it. We didn't do any destructive sampling on that one, but goose browsing actually unearthed a neighboring plant, which is no longer there. And there's just an extraordinary individual. So these are the old growth. This is the old growth of the understory in these meadows in the Salish Sea. And we don't often think about understory as old growth, but really, these plants are ancient and they are culturally significant. The camas and the chocolate lily, these were key food plants for First Nations. They're their main source of carbohydrate. These plants were, these tubers were traded up and down the coast and inland. And so this is a recent photo of Halibut Island, what it's starting to look like. And this is bare stem desert parsley, or also called kakmeen, or consumption plant. So this is a key medicinal plant, and packed full of vitamins, and a plant that you just don't find virtually on any of the big islands, or on any of the islands that have deer present. So in another project, we're working really closely with Kwakwam group. This is a Cowichan-based group with it's driven by elders and youth, and it's all about cultural revitalization. And again, here we're restoring an area. This is on Salt Spring Island. Some people might have visited Burgoyne Provincial Park. Well, the traditional Hulkamini name is Kwakwam, and Kwakwam, Kwakwa is the sound that a female mergansers make, and this is an area where mergansers come to gather. And so we're working with parks and these amazing young Cowichan leaders in their community to restore these ancient meadows, which have been used for agriculture for the last European agriculture, I should say, for the last 150 years, and we're converting those back into food gardens. And this process of ecocultural restoration, it's not just about getting plants back in to, these native plants back in the soil and creating the ecological conditions. It's actually also about creating the cultural conditions. And so a large part of this project, driven by Cowichan, is also about getting language back, being spoken, the languages, the words of these plants being spoken on the land, the dances being danced, the canoes being built and launched, the poles being raised. And so, and the nations being able to live back on this land and practice their culture. This is one of the elders to Selim, who's been kind of leading a lot of the, really a lot of the entire program of ecocultural restoration in this particular place has been spearheaded by him and his wife. And this is that's the back of my little boy's head there. And so one of the it's going forward, we have these sites. This is Sydney Island. This is within the Gulf Islands National Park on Sydney Island, where they have both black-tailed deer, and they also have introduced fallow deer. And, we're really trying to figure out how do we go from something like this to something like this, which was taken, this photo is on Penelakut Island, an island that is stewarded by Penelakut First Nations, an island where they actively hunt deer. So deer are at very low numbers. And, the difference is staggering. And so we have to start to question, are we doing the right types of things? Are we really dealing with the most serious threats to these ecosystems? What I found in our local conservancy, on Salt Spring Island, is we've been very focused on invasive species and on dealing with things that are maybe somewhat easier to deal with because they're socially acceptable, but we've been very reluctant to deal with harder issues like deer hyperabundance. But if we want to, move ecosystems from this to back to this, which is another restoration project that we've been working on for 15 years now. It's called Yellow Island. It's in the San Juans. And this is just another extraordinary example of how you can turn a system back into an incredible food garden, teeming with a diversity of plants. So I think the thing that keeps me excited and motivated is this this notion that one day maybe my grandchildren will be able to walk through a meadow like this and harvest camas and dig a pit and roast camas and eat salmon and learn about all of the traditional uses of these incredible plants and ecosystems from our neighbors and from our Indigenous elders and friends and family. And this is a great quote from James Swan, one of the 19th century ethnographers and naturalists. And he says that I never met with a white person who is not fond of baked camas, and I do not know any vegetable except fried bananas so delicious. I sure hope that one day we can all say that we've tried baked camas, and that would be an extraordinary feat if there is that much camas around that we could actually harvest them. So just to cap off, what are we learning? Well, we're learning that the loss of Indigenous stewardship and the loss of top predators and the alteration of those predator populations is contributing to shifting baselines of what we perceive as normal in these spaces. Overbrowsing by deer leads to the loss of culturally important plants and complete structural changes in the vegetation, which in turn lead to successional changes in the forest. So even though the forest overstory may not be immediately impacted by deer browsing, it will be in the future because we've completely lost any recruitment of some of our deciduous species like Gary oak, arbutus, dogwood, poplars. A bunch of things that used to be very common in these ecosystems are no longer common. We've switched to a system which is dominated by fir species, and that's going to lead to some big changes in the future. These Gary oaks and arbutus that we see now are essentially the living dead. We're seeing this alteration, these changes are leading to changes in our songbirds and changes in our pollinator populations. And we know that deer densities need to reduce dramatically. We know that we need to learn to live with predators, and we need to reflect on the history of these places and the impact of colonization and start to invite and learn from our Indigenous elders and neighbors about the importance and of Indigenous stewardship practices for these places. So as I said, the work is continuing. We have a big project to explore a whole range of cumulative impacts. and continuing to work with the nations to shape that work and to actively be back on the land and start to test these different types of restoration activities. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up for discussion. And I just want to thank you again for inviting me to join you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tara. So we're open for questions now. And if you have a question, you can wave your hand in front of the screen, in front of your camera, or you can go into the reactions button and press raise hand. But I wanted to start with something I think I missed. Tara, you mentioned that the islands that have had Indigenous stewardship are better off ecologically than the ones that haven't. And do you know what sort of practices it is that they do that are having positive effects?
Yeah, so I think a key one is that they're hunting. So they're actively hunting. And we've lost hunting on most of the other islands. So there's no hunting in our parks, in the Gulf Islands National Park, for example. And there are, most of the land base is private, and hunting has gone out of favor. So it's very hard to hunt. And so that is something that is leading to this hyperabundance of deer, of herbivores. And at the same time, one thing that is being hunted is anytime a cougar or a wolf will swim to one of these islands, it does get shot. And so a wolf arrived on Sydney Island, which is a park, and they shot it. So it's very curious. You know, we have probably one of the biggest kind of ecological disasters unfolding in this region as a result of deer hyperabundance, yet no one except for the nations are actually addressing that issue.
Thanks, Tara. We have a question from Ray and then one from in the chat.
Yeah, Tara, thank you for a really superb presentation. My question follows on from what you just said in terms of predators, cougars and wolves. Has there been any thought to introducing predators, or is it just too much human population pressure now in these areas to even consider something like that?
Yeah, I just stopped sharing so I can see all of you better. So I'm glad you asked that. One of the projects that we're working on right now is looking at what is the going to be kind of the most cost-effective way to steward deer going forward. And so we're looking at options of reintroducing cougars, wolves. We're looking at different types of hunting, from getting professional hunters in, getting First Nation-led hunting. We're looking at birth control, a whole range of options. and so we're actually just about to publish that work. I can tell you that the birth control is not a cost-effective option, and that Indigenous stewardship and professional hunting certainly is looking like it's probably the most cost-effective options. So we need to, humans have been the top predator in this system for millennia, and we need to reassert that top-down control. Otherwise, we're going to lose some of our most magical biodiversity in this system.
Just mentioned, Tara, you probably know about this, the Galiano Conservancy. They just sent a message about their Feed the People event today. You're aware of that?
Yeah, so that's a great program, and we've been working with Galiano Conservancy on. They have a program where they work with Penelakut elders who come and hunt deer in one of their ecological reserves. And then they're teaching folks how to process an animal, so how to break it down, and really just trying to educate the settler community around how to be good stewards of the land, because most people in this region, if they do eat meat, they're wanting to source meat that's ecologically friendly, that has a low carbon footprint, that's grown locally. You can't get any better than venison. And, it's not about eradicating deer, it's about regaining the balance.
We have a related question in the chat about what can be done about the large number of deer on the Sunshine Coast. And then how can one go about restoring the meadow environment, and can it be done with fences?
Yeah. So in the short term, fences work, and we've just put up several large exclosures on Salt Spring Island, because that's the only way that we can save these meadows in the short term on some of these larger islands, where it's going to be a lot longer term, strategy to reduce deer numbers overall. Is going to take a long time, but we know we need to act quickly to save some of these meadow communities. And so fences really are, sadly, they're the only option in the short term for some of these important ecosystems.
Yeah, I actually had to put a fence around our property to keep the elk out, because we have elk as well, which just savage every bit of native vegetation. Then I wanted to put in a wildflower meadow. And then when I did that, I found out I had to put in another fence to keep the deer out of that area. But what I'm finding is that, it looks good for one season, and then there's just not enough of the native wildflowers that are competing with everything else. So I'm wondering, is there something special about like the Gulf Islands, the drier parts? Is it easier there, or is it the burning? Is that necessary?
Yeah, so I think burning is part of it. I think so. Once the seed propagules, sometimes you have to reintroduce things. So these plants like camas and chocolate lily, they can exist in the soil for a very long time without even flowering. But once that starch is gone and it disappears, they don't have a high dispersal capacity. So in some cases you need to actually bring the propagules back, if they're not there in the seed bank. The other piece is dealing with encroachment. So we have Doug fir, other species of tree that will tend to encroach in the absence of fire. And so a lot of these meadow plants, they need light. And if it gets too shrubby, too many shrubs, too many trees, then they're not going to thrive. And fire was really the natural way to deal with that. In the absence of fire, because it's not easy to light a match in the Gulf Islands. It's a lot of resistance to that for good reason. We've been cutting out shrubs. We've been girdling trees, so girdling firs, and just allowing for a slow death of trees to allow more light into these areas. But I think that's one of the main things, is to try to manage. You have to manage that regrowth of tree species in the absence of fire.
Yeah, there was a question related to that. Once the deer are gone, how do you restore the forest, or do you let it return to meadow? But it will come back to forest on its own, right? And you'll lose the meadow then. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's right. So these are ecocultural landscapes. These meadows were maintained by nations through burning. And in the absence of burning, they will turn into a Doug fir or a hemlock forest. That's what they're designed to do. And except for in the driest, shallowest soil areas. And so in order to keep the meadows, we do have to manage that tree and the shrubs taking over.
And there's another one about, is there a source for the native plants and tubers? I've tried the BC Botanical Garden and native nurseries like Linnea, but those plants are not available. Yeah, so if we want to plant some of these, where do we get them?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of excellent nurseries on Vancouver Island. That's a little bit far from where you are. But
Well,
there's
the problem is it involves a ferry journey, which is a big problem this year.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, you cannot count on a ferry these days.
Yeah.
Satin Flower Nursery is wonderful. Cowichan Native Nursery is wonderful. I'll do a little bit of digging. There is a couple of native nurseries in the Lower Mainland, but there must be something closer to the Sunshine Coast. I'll do a little bit of digging around.
I think the closest is the one in Maplewood on the North Shore. I don't know if anybody's
yeah,
been there.
You mean the Wild Bird Trust?
I think so.
Yeah, that's the one in Maplewood.
Yeah,
Then there's Nat's Nursery down in Abbotsford.
they have some native.
Oh, beautiful natives.
Do
yeah,
they?
that's a good one. Yeah.
Nat's, yeah. Minimum orders though, usually by groups.
Yeah, it's something, as you know, as a conservancy, you could do a bulk order too. That you could organize yourselves to do a bulk order from. That would be probably more economical to do it that way. Yeah.
I found some good seeds for the native wildflowers, native coastal wildflowers. But you have to order them. No, there's that place down in Gibson's, Quality Pet and Garden, something like that.
Okay.
Yes,
It has, yeah, it carries these seeds, and one of them worked out really well. And I tried a couple from other companies and they didn't work at all. But it requires quite a bit of prep.
Yeah. Satin Flower is a good one, and they're based on Vancouver Island, but they do sell seeds. Yeah.
Have you
Go ahead, Susan.
have you considered the fire smart plants? Now, are they a part of your baseline studies that these new fire smart BC plants that are coming out on the market now? Have you given any thought to those, or are they even native?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Susan. So we're thinking about that a lot because a lot of those fire smart practices have been developed based on interior forests, and they actually we believe are probably not suitable for these coastal forests, which rely on a dense understory to stop fire. So the coastal Douglas fir forest, for example, when that understory is intact, it's very hard to get a fire through that. Whereas when that understory is missing and you have this kind of grassy, mossy understory, which is most common these days, fires rip through there. And so that's one of the things that we're doing with those soil moisture meters, is we're trying to understand how the interaction between browsing, the loss of understory, is influencing the soil horizon in terms of soil moisture. And because we have a strong sense that we need to be thinking about fire in these coastal areas and fire smart in a very different way from what is being recommended elsewhere in the province.
Thank you. That was very informative.
Carol.
Yeah, I was going to say, Cindy, I don't know if we lost your audio there for a second. No, I can't hear you. But anyway, I have a question, so you can work on that while I'm asking my question. I heard you mention something about the Gary Oak and the arbutus being the living dead. Did I get that right? Because on
Yeah.
my property, it's we have a ton of arbutus, and over the years that they've kind of been, dying off, and then they're sprouting out from the bottom. But then we have like a whole meadow area as well with a lot of camas. So I was just wondering if you can explain what you meant by the living dead, like, or is that like in the next 50 years, 100 years, 300 years? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so what we're finding is that these species of tree that deer like to browse are not able to recruit. And so even though they're making seed, those seedlings are unable to get established and grow into the next generation of trees. And so when you look at the age cohort of Gary Oaks and arbutus, they're all very similar age structure. We're not finding young recruits. And if we do find them, it's generally because they're protected from browsing. They're in either in an behind a fence. So in one of the exclosures that we put up this past year, we've now, within this exclosure, which is only 3.5 hectares, we have over 1,500 seedlings of Gary Oak and arbutus that have come up. It's extraordinary. They're going to thin themselves out, but in our control plots outside, we have next to zero. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the living dead, is that we need to have recruitment. Once these big old trees die, which is going to happen in the next 50 years, a lot of these trees will be dying. There's no younger ones to take their place. So there's a question saying, I think deer hang out in people's gardens, not in the forest so much. How can deer populations be managed under that scenario? Well, absolutely. We've created the conditions that deer love. We've created a lot of agricultural areas and lawn and wonderful gardens full of orchards and all kinds of tasty snacks. And so without cooperation from landholders, it's going to be very hard. One thing landholders anyone that wants to really grow a good food garden has to put up a fence. It's pretty much impossible to grow vegetables and without having them fenced. But even orchards, can contribute to a lot of food for deer, and hay fields even. So, definitely deer's preferred habitat are in these meadows. They do go into the forests, but they prefer, their densities are highest in the meadows because that is their preferred habitat. So meadows, lawns, gardens, these managed areas. And so, I think folks on small properties, it's hard, other than fencing out your garden, it's hard to know what to do. But working as a community and working with landholders that have maybe large parcels of land, they may not be hunters, but by connecting landholders with hunters, that's something that we're doing on some of the Gulf Islands, is facilitating these relationships between hunters and landholders so that hunting can occur safely on larger parcels of land.
I have another question. As it gets more popular around the Sunshine Coast, the trails that I used to walk on that were single track are now becoming very large tracks. And I'm noticing some of the kind of meadowy areas are losing their soil and it's turning into rock because there's so many rocks, and a lot of these places are in parks. So I wonder if you've talked with parks, or is there anything, are they aware that this is happening? Or
Yeah, Yeah, this is a really challenging issue, is that these places get loved to death, you know, in terms of the human traffic, dog traffic, bike traffic, in these, you know, fragile soils, shallow soil sites. It's I think it's something that Parks is aware of, and they have they have multiple mandates. One of their most important mandates is not necessarily conservation, but is in providing amenity spaces for people, and that doesn't always gel with conservation. So I think the only thing that we can do is to keep, you know, pressuring our park managers to protect these areas that are particularly important ecologically. So these meadow habitats and these areas which still have a lot of that native fauna present, and you know, signage, keeping people on the trails, but also just fencing out some areas so that people can't go in the areas, maybe putting a bench beside it so people can look in, but not walk through. I just see
Cindy, oh,
yeah,
I was just
Cindy.
going to see if Cindy got her mic back. If not, I was going to read out this next comment. No, I don't hear you. All right, we're just, I'll take over for Cindy here. We have a comment that says, here in Egmont, a Sechelt Nation-owned company is embarking on a shocking amount of clear cutting. Our community feels like we're on the front lines of the BC government's strategy of throwing native land rights up as a front for BC timber sales policy of logging without pause. Is there any way to push for sustainable stewardship with?
Yeah, this is a really sad thing that is happening in many places, and that you know, our forestry companies have pillaged every inch of our province for a very long time, and now you know, nations are finally getting a piece of this industry, but it's kind of at the 11th hour. And so it's a really challenging situation of some nations have invested in trying to develop their own you know, their own sustainable version of forestry, but now they're in the crossroads of trying to protect these last places. So I think this is a really this is a very kind of challenging time in forest politics in our province, where we know we can't continue doing business as usual. We know that nations have every right to share in the resources in the province, and that they've really been excluded from sharing in these resources for the last 150 years. But how do we support that happening in a sustainable way, in a good way, and trying to hold nations to, you know, do sustainable forestry when other companies aren't held to the same bar is a bit rich as well. So we need to provide the incentives that nations can do forestry in a good way, and also get fair value for their wood. And so it's a big challenge, and there's a lot of good people kind of trying to work on that challenge. But yeah, I don't know what more to say. Cindy probably has some thoughts on that as well. Love to hear your thoughts.
Cindy just put in the chat that our speaker in November, Sue Grayston, will be talking more about that. So
Great.
If anybody wants to know more about that, in November 15th will be our next presentation. And I'll send some info out on that. Yeah. So if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up for the night. Any other last minute questions? All right, well, I just want to thank you so much, Tara. This was fantastic. We learned so much, and you know, it's always hard to hear what's going wrong and all the negative things, but you provided some pictures and a hope for, something that can get better and improve over time. So thank you so much. We appreciate you taking your time to talk to us. And I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat. So yeah, thank you very much. And for everybody who may not have seen the talk, we have it recorded and I'll put it on YouTube, and I'll send that link out later as well, so you can review it again another time.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Thank you very much.
Bye, Tara.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.